Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, your host for this week, as we're taking a look at a really ambitious and extremely interesting new book, We Are the Land, A History of Native California. And I'm joined by the two authors of the book, from a professor of history at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a member of the Round Valley Indian tribe. We have Willy Bauer. Willy, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for asking me.
And from Guilford College, where he's an associate professor of history, Damon Akins. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
So, first off the bat, I've got to ask you. This is a pretty big undertaking. I mean, it's California is a massive amount of space. It's hundreds upon hundreds of years. You're going back before the colonial history and then tracing all the way up to essentially the present day. This is absolutely massive undertaking. Why? What was the impetus to take on this large chunk of history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we both have been asking that ourselves that question here for the last couple years, actually, on this. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I think I wanted to kind of write something like this is that I noticed that there was kind of a gap. So someone hadn't written kind of a survey of California Indian history since the 1990s. And so I think we were able to kind of build on the work of two other Indigenous scholars. So in the 1960s, an Indigenous scholar named Jack Forbes wrote a survey of California. Actually, he wrote a survey of California and Nevada Indian history. And in the 1990s, a Cahuilla scholar, Rupert Costo, also wrote kind of a survey or kind of a general overview of California Indian history. But it's been a long time, right? It was the 1990s when Rupert wrote his book. And I think one of the kind of not deficiencies, but kind of one of the gaps, I think, in both of those texts is that there wasn't a lot of kind of understanding or kind of discussion of the 20th and 21st centuries. And, I think to kind of be able to kind of talk about the 20th and 21st century, I think it's vital for kind of California Indian people. It kind of corrects this kind of notion or this narrative of disappearance, as if California Indian people have disappeared from the continent. And so I think that was kind of the reason why I kind of got involved, or I kind of thought that such a project would be kind of vital now. And just to kind of provide something useful for California Indian people and for educators, K through 12, and even kind of community college, CSU educators, to kind of provide something on California Indian history for a California history class or a California Indian history class.
And you both are professors, but I should also mention that Damon, when we talk about educators, you also were in high school classrooms for a while, and so that's something that certainly you have a broad amount of experience, different age groups, in teaching this kind of history.
Yeah, I really drew on my experience. I'm currently a teacher at a small liberal arts college, so there's a lot of overlap between that and a high school classroom, in the sense that you're really engaged with the students. But I did draw a lot on my time teaching high school in Los Angeles.
And that's something that I think we're going to get into a little bit later in the podcast. Was very interesting about this book is that the history of California is something that is definitely taught. And I grew up on the other coast. I grew up in Massachusetts, but we learned plenty about the history of California, not necessarily the history of Native California, and some of the perspectives that you brought to some of those well-trod stories. Was very interesting in the book. One thing that I did want to ask is about the organization of the book, which is really cool. It goes chronologically, which makes sense, but then alongside each chronological chapter, you also have parted out various regions, or I think you use the term native spaces, to kind of give an overview of those spaces and some vignettes from those areas. What was it that gave you the impetus to do that and that form of organization?
Well, I'll take that one. I think, it was when we started trying to figure out how to organize the book, we knew we were going to take a chronological approach because we're historians and chronology is important. not just in the sense of change over time, but also showing how we got to where we are and being able to draw connections over time. But we also knew that there was a very clear need to make the book place-based, to make it, we imagined people reading it in California, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a history that lived on the pages, but that it was tied directly to the physical landscape, the real world that people lived in. So we began to imagine different places where people would be reading the book, and that over time evolved into these vignettes where we were thinking about how someone who knows a particular place, whether they're reading it in that location or whether they're from there or traveled there or went to school there, but how they might be approaching that space. So I think like San Diego, clearly somebody living in San Diego can look out their window and see a lot of history, and they may not have seen it without having a little bit of some guides, some pointers. But then also places like Ishii Wilderness, where I doubt people are going to be reading it in Ishii Wilderness, but I also know a lot of people think about that space, and some hold it quite dear, and we wanted to be able to point out what it is and what it means, and sort of problematize some of the expectations that people have of it. So that's where that came from, and I think I'm really pleased with the way, from the pedagogical standpoint, I'm really pleased with the way it turned out, because I've taught the book in manuscript form, and I had different students read those different vignettes and kind of use them as a launching pad to do a little bit more research on their own. And this is from North Carolina, and I could imagine doing it quite differently in California.
And one thing that I thought is going to be it's going to draw people's eyes pretty quickly when you talk about the vignettes. Okay, San Diego and Yuma and so on and so forth, and then Rome. It's one of these things is not like the other. There are obvious things that come to mind with Rome, the Catholic Church, the missionaries, and all that. But what exactly about Rome was the thing that brought you to put it into this book?
I think one of the reasons, and Damon, if you have kind of a different take on this, chime in, obviously. But I think one of the things we also kind of thought about when we were writing the book is to understand, like, what we understand to be the current boundaries of California are quite actually artificial, right? And actually kind of in global history, right? They're actually rather recent. And so I think that we wanted to kind of explode the notion of what people, or how people kind of think about California Indian people and California Indian people. And I think we both kind of wanted to emphasize the abilities of California Indian people to travel outside the boundaries of what are the current boundaries of the state. And so there's a kind of a well-known Luiseño young man named Pablo Toc, who traveled to Rome in the early 19th century. He studied there. He wrote history, kind of a Luiseño history in Rome. He left behind a dictionary of the Luiseño language, and all of these. And so he passes away in Rome. And so his bones are left there. His writings and his intellectual the things that he produced were left behind there. And so I think it was kind of an interesting way for us to kind of think about kind of California Indians kind of moving throughout the world. And then if we kind of unpack that if that's not only unique to Rome, but it happens in London, right? So in the British Museum, there are several baskets from Pomo basket makers. And so those living entities have made the trip across the Atlantic and haven't returned home yet. And so I think we just kind of wanted to kind of get people to kind of think about different ways of thinking about kind of California Indian people moving throughout the world, and just kind of different vantage points on these places.
And one of the things that you touched on in that answer, which I found very interesting, it's kind of a narrative that feels like it runs throughout much of the book, is just the fact that California is massive. It's a huge state. It's the idea that somebody living essentially right next to what's now the Arizona border, and somebody on the far coast in the northwest of California would be somehow connected if you went back, hundreds of years before these borders existed, would kind of seem crazy that the peoples and the geography and all that are so very different. But then there does seem to be a lot of sense, because now, politically speaking, California is a very important entity. And especially later on in the book, you talk about the activism that has taken place. And a lot of that does end up having to center around the state and the United States as an entity. So I was wondering, I guess, how relevant is the concept of California in the Native history? Is it something that is that is just kind of, oh, this is an arbitrary boundary, doesn't really make sense, or it does feel like there is presence, especially now?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, and I may try to loop back to one of the things about Rome as part of it. I think the way I'd frame the question slightly differently is how important are Californias, because I think over time there have been different iterations of what we call California, Alta California, when it was under the Mexican and Spanish regime. So I think you're right in pointing out that at the beginning it wasn't a thing, and we were really careful about the maps that we use. So the map in the frontispiece, the first one, does not have a state boundary, doesn't have, to my recollection, anything that would signify the kind of political or civil boundaries of the state of California, because we envisioned it as a kind of a beginning point, a point at which our narrative starts. And at that point, there is no California. And we wanted it to be really an indigenous map. And so I think in the early parts of the chapter, California isn't even a factor. But as you suggested, over time, and I think this happens in almost any instance in which indigenous people encounter a settler colonial society, they have to reckon with a category that's ascribed to them that is then how power or oppression or dispossession, what it flows through. So California became a thing that the native people in the region had to deal with. And I think over the beginning of the 20th century, you really see that pivot to embracing the idea of California Indians as a political tool that didn't erase, tribal identity or regional identity, but now became a tool that had been foisted on them that they could use. And I think so over time, California comes into existence and definitely has to be a part of it now, because California Indians today are a critical part of the thing that is California.
It's a fascinating idea as to how, you think that the boundaries are arbitrary. In many ways they are, but whether or not they are arbitrary, eventually, because they're set in stone, they don't become arbitrary. And somebody who's living, where you are, Willy, in Nevada, which could be, you're not that far from California, are you, in Las Vegas? And yet technically somebody living there is just, they're not going to Sacramento, they're not going, it's a completely different system there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, but I think we were kind of always aware of how people have. I think we've been aware of that boundary, and I think one of the things I've always thought about is kind of the designation of a California Indian is actually quite unique if we kind of think about it from how anthropologists, for instance, have discussed these issues, right? So in the early 20th century, anthropologists divided North America into these cultural areas, and so. Right, that kind of making the argument that all people were kind of, in one region were related to, had very kind of similar cultural attributes. And so, like, you have a region called, like, the Great Plains, or you have, where I'm in Nevada, right, the Great Basin. But, right, California is unique because they're the only kind of cultural area kind of named after a state boundary, not kind of not like a geological or a geographic one. And so it kind of, I think one of the things we tried to do is kind of, I think as Damon was mentioning, is try to kind of unpack what California means, and then not kind of isolate, I guess, indigenous peoples into the space. We wanted to kind of show kind of this kind of both indigenous peoples kind of moving about what we understand to be the state and even kind of leading the state, as we kind of discussed with the Rome, but also indigenous peoples coming to California as well.
And one thing that I also, kind of getting back to the topic of Rome, and the topic of this historian who was a native from California who goes off to Rome writing these histories, writing dictionary of the language. There's a real sense of agency there, I guess is the right word to put it, that is often lost in all this. And I think of the border as well as something that is often thought of as, and it was imposed upon people there, But yet, does that actually, take away, much like, and we'll get into this a little later, writing of histories by, non-native people takes away some of these agencies and creates, as you say, these sort of categorizations that may or may not actually resonate with native peoples, indigenous peoples.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think one of the things so Pablo Tak is this pivotal figure. It's a critical thing. We knew we needed to spend plenty of time dealing with Pablo Tak for exactly that reason. It is so important. But over time, scholars have moved from a position, I don't know, in the 50s, where he was sort of seen as not necessarily really a native scholar. More or less, he'd been co-opted into the Catholic faith and wasn't, quote, a reliable narrative about indigenous issues. His story has largely been rediscovered, repacked. I mean, it's been literally retranslated and reorganized to reflect what it was, rather than what some scholars in the 1950s had reordered it to be to make sense to them. And as such, like his agency, as you say, has been restored. And I think one of the things we really wanted to do with the Rome vignette, had we been able to spend, I think, 30 pages on that, would have been really to trace a lot of these people that were there back. And we traced a few of the people who, from other indigenous people from what is now the United States, who were also at the College of Propaganda at roughly the same time. We traced them back and sort of imagined through their actions, what we thought Pablo Tak might have been able to accomplish. So not just the agency in terms of writing the manuscript, but trying to imagine what that same kind of intellectual impulse would have meant had he followed through with this course of study, which would have been to come back to California as a Catholic priest, and how he may have been able to use that in a really, really fascinating way.
And that's something I also wanted to ask, because it gets to a bit of a question. The term that I think of is authenticity, but it's generally speaking, in a kind of a narrative that many people think of, it's the Catholic Church, and then there's native peoples on the other side of it, and the Catholic Church is and there's certainly reason for that, because there was a lot of issues with the Catholic Church being a large part of this colonial empire. But also it means that we tend to think of indigenous peoples as, well, the real authentic indigenous peoples were the people who were there in 1500. And if somebody converts to Catholicism, or if somebody takes on some of the trappings of that, colonial society, or of, quote, white society, they are no longer authentic. And the real authentic bit is earlier. I thought that this book did a great job, because you follow it, and again, all the way up to the present day, showing a lot of authentic voices, but that do not hew to that stereotype of the kind of, well, the pre-colonial is the only authentic vision. And I was just wondering how you approached that concept, because that's one that's very popular in popular consciousness.
Yeah, and I think that kind of builds on this notion of this kind of long-standing idea in North America, but also kind of one that is especially kind of emphasized in California, is that this notion of the vanishing Indian, right? That indigenous peoples, through settler colonial processes, are going to be are vanishing. They're going to disappear. And I think it kind of sets up that notion that there was at one time kind of this pristine, authentic, singular kind of cultural practice, and then since then indigenous peoples have been contaminated so much so that at some point in the present or in the future, right, they'll disappear. And I think we really kind of wanted to kind of challenge those ideas and challenge those notions. I think the example of Pablo Tak going to Rome, right, and I think as Damon was mentioning earlier, kind of the agency, or maybe to kind of his kind of exerting kind of a sense of sovereignty in his own life, or kind of thinking through why he wrote these things, how he did so, but even kind of continuing on into the present day. I mean, I think we tried to kind of make this book as contemporary as possible, meaning that I was trying to remember when we actually sent off the manuscript, but it was kind of late May or early June or something along those lines. We're all in the middle of the kind of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone was kind of isolated, in our homes, and I think one of the things that I appreciated, or what I thought, one of the things I liked about the book, is that we were able to kind of bring in examples from how California Indian peoples kind of were responding to and shaping even the pandemic. We couldn't kind of develop a lot of those examples, but we included some of them to make the book as kind of contemporary as possible. And so I think one of the reasons what that does is it shows that California Indian people are an enduring people. They have a past, present, and they definitely have a future. And so these kind of notions about authenticity and tradition are actually kind of undermined by California Indian and people's actions.
And I should mention, this is something that I wanted to bring up. This is a history of Native California, co-written by somebody who is a California Indian. And so when we're talking about, the Vanishing Indian, we're talking about you. I mean, you are not a vanishing person. I can see you, Willy, on the other end of the line here. And how important was it for specifically somebody with that background to be writing, and for you, specifically, was that something that you felt was an important part of this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the kind of the scholarship in the books that I've written in the past, right? I mean, I was talking to someone else about this a couple of weeks ago in an unrelated setting, but it was like, I mean, I as a scholar, I write about home, right? I think I've always kind of tended to kind of write narratives about the kind of centered or thinking about the place that I grew up. I grew up on the Round Valley Reservation, which is in Northern California. It's in rural Northern California, about 180 miles north of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I always I centered kind of my work, kind of thinking about that place and what it means, kind of, both kind of in a kind of contemporary setting, but also kind of the historical significance of it. And so, I mean, I think that's partly kind of the approach that I took. But one of the great things that I appreciate about working with Damon on the book is that I think we were able to kind of unite our intellectual strengths, right? So my research has always been kind of heavily kind of Northern California. That's where I've done kind of a lot of my work. Damon, I don't mean to kind of speak for you here, but your work was always on Southern California. So I thought we kind of were able to kind of bring our kind of geographic strengths together. And I think even our intellectual interests, right? I think, I've always kind of thought of myself as a bit of a labor historian, someone who kind of emphasizes the use of oral history and oral tradition, right? Kind of reviving, or using kind of native voices to communicate the past. And Damon, again, not to kind of speak to you, what you do, but I appreciated, your kind of attention to kind of environmental history, and also your kind of the attention to kind of visual culture and kind of the visual nature of the book. And so I thought, I mean, I thought our approaches to the book, I think, complemented each other quite well.
Yeah, I'd add in only that I think it's interesting that we never really spoke explicitly about the fact that Willy is Native and I'm not. That was never sort of like, there were no conversations like, okay, Willy, what's the Native perspective? And then Damon, what's the non-Native perspective? In fact, it wasn't even a conversation. I think obviously there was, in the way that we approach the work, for example, for myself, I'm very aware of my settler identity. I've learned as I teach in a college that has a very minimal Native presence, but is in Native land. I've had to come to a real comfortable position, or at least to recognize and reckon with publicly the fact that I'm a settler teaching on Native land, and that brings certain responsibilities, certain things that I need to address. And so I think that part of my teaching helped me kind of approach the book as not from a settler colonial perspective, but just really keenly aware of the power that settler colonial patterns have in the present, right? That's the big impact of settler colonial thought, is that this didn't end. It's still going on. And so therefore, as settlers, it's our responsibility to point to settler colonialism as a way to help identify what we want to dismantle. And I think those two approaches, really writing from home and me writing from a kind of critical perspective of my own position in a place, were really helpful, even though they weren't something that was explicit.
Well, that settler colonial mindset is actually something that I'd like to get into a bit more as we talk about. This is just a very large history, so we're not going to be able to narrate, nor should we, because you should go out and actually purchase the book. So we're not going to go through every single thing in the book, but I wanted to focus on one chapter in the book and one chapter in American history that is one of the iconic stories of the American kind of, I guess, manifest destiny, narrative, the make your own luck American dream kind of feel, which is this California gold rush happens in the mid 19th century, and it's something that I think every kid learns about in history class. And there's the football team out there, the San Francisco 49ers. It's ingrained in popular culture. You were taking a look at it from the indigenous point of view, and one of the things that I thought was very interesting, you said in the chapter that the United States differed in some of its policies in the sense that in Spain they used a lot of indigenous people for labor, but in the United States it was much more of kind of an eliminationist mindset, and that ends up playing out in many ways throughout the history. But the gold rush that brings so many people to California really highlights some of those tensions, it seems like, in the way in which indigenous people are treated. And just starting from kind of the point that gold is discovered, it seems like indigenous people at the start were okay with miners coming on. Maybe the miners weren't necessarily okay with the indigenous people, but that very, very quickly changed.
Yeah, I think. I have to say that was. There were two chapters that I think that were the hardest to write in the book. I think the California Gold Rush chapter was the hardest, and then I think the two chapters that we wrote on the kind of the Spanish Mexican kind of historical time period. And I think the reason for that is that's what everyone kind of writes about. If people write about California history, they're going to write usually about the gold rush or the Spanish mission era. And so I think we were kind of challenged to kind of offer kind of somewhat of a new kind of interpretation of that material, but also just kind of collect so much kind of good and sometimes not so good, scholarship and material that was produced about that time period. And I think that California Gold Rush time period is also kind of difficult because, and I think that's why the title of the chapter kind of speaks to this. Is this kind of, it's a period of destruction, and it's something that California Indian people kind of knew at the time, and remember. But I didn't think that we should. I don't think we didn't think that we should kind of only focus on this kind of period of destruction. I think we wanted to kind of highlight stories of kind of resilience too on the part of California Indian people and California Indian nations. And so, for example, I think in the middle there, in part of the chapter is a discussion of the Hupa in Hupa Valley, which is in Northern California, and then who, while there are these kind of campaigns of what we would call genocide going on around them, they're also kind of fighting to stay in their homeland, and they successfully do so. And so, there was kind of a moment where people wanted to remove Hupas from their homelands to the Round Valley Reservation, where I'm from, and Hupas were like, "No, we're not going. We're going to resist, and we're going to stay in and on our lands." And I think that's the kind of the narrative that I think. Obviously, we had to kind of deal with the violence, but I think we wanted to highlight these stories of kind of resilience and native endurance in place.
And that's a very good point, which is it comes up so much, not only in studies of indigenous history, but you think of Black history, you think of a lot of histories from people who are minoritized or have been historically sidelined. There's this tendency to want the suffering or to want to focus on the suffering in some part. Because there was legitimate grievances, legitimate problems, and yet then it seems like you were a little worried about creating something that just focused on the negative, and not necessarily, you didn't want to whitewash, you didn't want to paint a rosy picture, look everything through rose tinted glasses, but you wanted to show that concept that no, there were people who were trying to do positive things. There were people who were trying to, push back against the negative things that were happening. And there are still, people who are working very hard towards a better future.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a funny memory that maybe illustrates this point, Willie. We haven't talked about this, but this was at a conference sometime, I don't know, probably 2015. So we were in the process of writing the book, and whenever we'd go to a conference, we'd end up having a drink and talking about where we were. There've been ongoing discussions about genocide, the language, using the language genocide to describe what's happened. It's been going on since the 70s, but there are periods where it kind of blows up in the scholarship. And this was one of those times where there had been a panel and somebody had gotten upset, and it was sort of like this little like tempest in a teapot sort of thing. And I remember we were having a drink and we were talking about that and how we bring it back to the book. And you made it clear, like, genocide is just such a problematic term. And I was like, well, why is that? And he said, hello, like, I'm right here, and it gets back to that point of like, it's so difficult to say, we need to clarify that what happened was genocide. I mean, it fits the definition, and it was awful and it was catastrophic, but it didn't accomplish its goals. It did not eradicate. It did not erase. It did not diminish. So you have to show enough to show how devastating it was. But you have to measure or kind of leaven that devastation with ways that Indians engaged in the word that we used probably 2 or 3 times in the book of survivance, a term that's grown a lot more common and popular in recent years, Gerald Visner's term. But I think that idea of thriving through surviving is something that we were aiming for, but genocide's a tough one. It's a tough needle to thread.
And that's something that I also wanted to ask you about, because it seems like, again, a lot of histories, not necessarily, I'm sure in the academic sense, I'm talking more about as somebody who isn't, from this kind of academic background, stuff that I know about. You think about the Indian wars and the issues, in the late 19th century, and then it's kind of like, well, all right, then that was that, and the terrible line of how the West was won and all that. There was a lot of activism that you detailed in here that was certainly news to me. I'm sure news to a lot of people in the 20th and into the 21st centuries. And it is still raging on, working around definitions and histories and what all of that means. And yeah, if you'd just be able to sort of give people a sense of some of the big, maybe more recent sort of activist pushes that we're seeing. I mean, it's even, there have been news stories coming out, Supreme Court cases and all that about Indigenous issues in the past year. Even, since you've handed in the manuscript.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we probably could both offer a few. I was thinking recently I've been doing some thinking along the lines of how the book might land in high school classrooms. And so I've been looking at the ethnic studies curriculum that California is wrestling with. I mean, as in last week. So that's an area in which Native people are finding a voice in a place that has been pretty inimical to them. I mean, like, I think the curriculum has never been a place that has invited Native voices. When I taught high school in Los Angeles, we were about 10-minute drive from the site of the San Fernando Mission. And there was no recognition at the high school level of that being there or this being in that place. And I think that's beginning to change as late as it is. So I think that's one element that I see as, and to be clear, we're seeing Native scholars, Native activists engaging in the classroom, engaging in the production of curriculum, and helping to shape it, and in some cases shaping it. And I think the other thing that's been striking to me is how far along the land back movement has gone. When I started teaching, I would have to tell students, like, sometimes students would say something like, but they lost the land. And I'd say, well, I mean, not yet. And it's sort of flipping this idea that, like, yes, in a narrow time frame, but like at some point in the future. And same thing with the Washington football team. I used to tell students, like, oh, of course that's going to change. When? I don't know. I mean, of course it's going to change. And it did. And it happened, I think, sooner than some people did and later than many people wish. But I say the same sort of thing with the land back movement. There's a lot of people today who are really getting, if not traction, at least attention to this idea that like one of the solutions to many of the problems today is to give the land back to the people who've stewarded it for hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years. And I think like of the Segorte movement and the land trust in the Bay Area, where now they've set up this online opportunity for people to pay a shumi or a tax. So you can log on and decide how, where do you live? Do you rent? Do you own your home? And then they'll calculate your monthly tax and you can make an online contribution. That's so simple, but I think it was hard to imagine that being a thing even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It wouldn't have had the kind of traction that would have gotten it mainstream attention like it is now. And so those are some of the things that I think are really in the moment.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we did nicely is actually kind of ending the book on a kind of a effort of land back and kind of showing kind of the possibilities of this. And I think the other of land back. And I think the other thing that I know that Damon kind of emphasized in our conversations when we were talking about writing the book, especially kind of as we moved in, I think, into the 20th century, was that these aren't just kind of flashpoints that pop up kind of out of thin air, but they're kind of building on kind of a long history of kind of indigenous people in California, kind of fighting for land, demanding the return of land, demanding control over lands and resources. And so, I think that's why I think that's one of the kind of the most important aspects of the book. I think it's telling that 20th and 21st century story. I think a lot of times, as we were kind of talking, maybe as I mentioned earlier too, is I think that California people kind of think that California Indian history ends with the gold rush. That's the moment that they disappear, and people kind of ignore what happens after, say, after the 1870s and into the 20th century. And I think being able to kind of tell some of those stories of Native of Native activism in the late 19th, the 20th, into the 21st century, I think it's one of the things that I'm kind of extremely kind of happy with the book about.
Yeah. Me too.
One thing that struck me in reading about some of the things that were happening, say, in the mid and late 20th century, was that certainly a lot of it seemed to go through the courts, that the courts seemed to have a huge impact, and that also there were some very bold steps taken. I guess, a lot of people associate, reservations and Indian places with things like gambling and certain things being, not having state tax, so on and so forth. And I guess I hadn't realized how much of that was essentially just people deciding one day, okay, we're going to do this thing. We're not going to charge state tax for, cigarettes at our smoke shop, and they get taken to court. And then they win. They win the right. Which is maybe it's not the civil disobedience of sitting at the lunch counter and singing Kumbaya or whatever that people think of when they think civil disobedience, but it's a very practical method that that has had huge results.
Yeah, I think one way to approach that is that sovereignty isn't this like gift that's, given to the Indians in a box. Like they open it up and say, hey, look, it's sovereignty, right? We can use this. Instead, it is a thing that has to be consistently articulated and asserted and defended and fought for it consistently. It can't, once you've won a court case, doesn't mean you sit back and prop your feet up and say, we have sovereignty, it is something that is consistently under attack. And I think that, you can see that taking place early in the 20th century in the courts and ways that often get obscured. And so I'm really pleased with the fact that we were able to draw some connections between what's happening today, what was happening in the 80s, what was happening in the 50s, and then what was happening in the 20s, that these are all different ways to consistently kind of push at that boundary to say, this is a space that we're going to create. And we're going to maintain those boundaries. We're going to fight for those boundaries, and we're going to, monitor them and continue to fight for them. I think that's really helpful. I think it's helpful for me in teaching students that sovereignty is not just a thing.
And that is, and Willy?
The only thing I was going to add there is I think one of the things that I think came out of that discussion and that emphasis on, say, court cases and kind of is that, California Indians weren't just kind of passerbys or on the sidelines of these battles for kind of sovereignty in the United States. Actually, in a lot of ways, California Indian people were kind of pushing these efforts to kind of claim sovereignty in the 19th and in the 20th and the 21st century. And so I think it was kind of important to kind of highlight those efforts by California Indian people.
And one thing that is, I think, really important in that narrative, and it's something that I think is often, again, an issue when we talk about historically disadvantaged groups, is that there's often the kind of the high and mighty, the noble cause, that, you know, freedom, or you know, this and that thing, that are kind of these concepts, but then there's a resistance to actually give, like, land or you know, or monetary, you know, things that physically will actually help, and it almost is painted as something that's greedy, or it's grabby, which is crazy coming from this kind of settler colonial mindset where you steal something and then you accuse someone of greed for wanting it back. But that's how it's formed. And I was just wondering, in terms of, I guess, giving a bit more dignity to actual material, whether they be monetary, whether they be land, you know, goals, rather than the kind of, oh, we just all want to get together, you know, we just all want to, the lofty kind of ideals that people think of when they think of, you know, things like civil rights.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story that I heard it from Kucha Risling-Baldi, who's a Hoopa scholar, and she tells this story. This is how she taught it with her students, is that she imagines, like, you've got a laptop, you're using your laptop, somebody comes and takes it, and you say, hey, give me my laptop back. And they say, well, we can share it. Right. And you say, no, I mean, like, just give me the laptop back. Well, okay, you can use it more than I can, but I still get to, like, look and make sure that what you're doing on it is right. You know, and she just goes through these series of examples like that. And she describes the students just going, like, yeah, just give the land back. I mean, just give the laptop back, like, just give it back. And I think we had to, you know, treat this carefully, because it's an important point, but it's also a delicate point. Part of sovereignty is the right to make decisions that are bad. I mean, that the right to make decisions that that I may not like, the federal government may not like, other Native groups may not like. And, you know, sovereignty doesn't exist just when Native people do things right, you know, and I think that was something that we had to point to in some places, that there are disagreements among Native people, which isn't about one group being right or wrong, but about the fact that sovereignty means that they can make those decisions. That's the decision that, it's not a decision that falls under a moral category. I mean, it is a legal decision. It's a decision that is based on the will of the people.
I have been unfortunate enough to run across these multiple times, but just recently there was an article that was going around from some idiot talking about how essentially failure of, you know, certain reservation governments is sort of indicative of some broader problem and got to be, you know, dismantled or taken over, so on and so forth. And that it is a very interesting point that there's still that paternalistic impulse in that concept that, well, they're not doing it right, so I guess we've just got to step in then.
Yeah, I always say to my students, thankfully we in the United States have a political system that runs seamlessly. You know, that, like, thankfully, it would be awful if we didn't.
Yeah, I think, yeah, kind of in a related part of this is that I think one of the issues that we addressed, you know, in the last chapter of the book, and I think we talked a lot about this, was the issue of disenrollment in California. Right,
Yeah,
it's something that is quite controversial. It's something that we, you know, it's kind of couched in kind of it's been traditionally kind of couched in the history of gaming, and it's probably things that even kind of Indigenous peoples in the United States are quite critical about these aspects of disenrollment. But I think one of the things we effectively did was that we also discussed how California Indian tribes could reverse disenrollment. They can kind of invite back, you know, bring back the people who had been disenrolled in the past, or even kind of pass laws that prevent future disenrollment. And so I think we were able to kind of discuss kind of a well-rounded discussion of kind of the issues about sovereignty that we've been talking about.
And that's something I guess I also wanted to ask as we start wrapping up, in terms of big takeaways. there's like 50,000 that you can get from this book. And again, anyone who's listening to this, you should go out and purchase this immediately. And I'm not just saying that because I'm currently talking to the to the people who wrote it. What are some of the big takeaways that you would like someone to walk away from this book? It gets back to the opening question I said of the sort of the reason why you started doing it. But what are some of the things that you want, both in terms of, and maybe this is one way to look at it, and Indigenous, a California Indian person reading it, versus somebody who isn't, or somebody who is well versed in this topic versus somebody who isn't. What are some things that you would like people walking away from this book thinking?
I think I have two. I think one is combating the notion that California Indians disappeared. And I think the reason that I have that is I remember a conversation I had with Greg Saris, who's the chairman of the Grattan Rancheria and a well-known kind of writer in California, a couple of years ago. And he told me, like, he said, right, there's still that notion that California Indians disappeared sometime in the 19th or the 20th century. And so if Greg Saris is telling me this, like, about 5 years ago, then that kind of pervasive idea still exists, and I think that's something that we need to kind of combat. And I think one of the things we effectively did in this book was counter that notion, and then kind of give the idea that you cannot understand California history without understanding the indigenous history of the region. And I think the second thing is for hopefully that California Indian people will read the book and they'll recognize some aspect of it in their own lives, right? Whether we're mentioning like one of their relatives, or a grandparent, or an aunt or uncle, or something along those lines, is that California Indian people kind of recognize their shared and unique histories in the book.
Yeah, I think those are two that I also share, and they're really great ones. I'd add one more from my perspective. I think, and it comes a lot from teaching in a largely non-native environment, and it has a lot to do with the fact, so the college I teach at's a Quaker school. Quakers love to think of themselves as people who have a great relationship, specifically with Native people, long tradition of abolitionism, long tradition of Quaker Native relations. And we have a lot of students engaged in social justice. And I think it's a really valuable place to start. But one of the things that I think is a takeaway is be careful what you're thinking about when you're thinking about helping or stepping in. And, so often students would come into a class with this idea that it is tragic what they've done to those Indians. What we should do instead is, and then they would start telling me. And I hope at least to take away from the book is, like, every time somebody's tried that, it's ended badly. And maybe it's time not to try that. Maybe it's time to just step back and say, hey, California Native people, they got it. I mean, they got it. They're doing it. And if there's help that can be offered, it needs to be offered in that framework. Not as yet another solution to, quote, the Indian problem. And I think that's something I'd love to see students take away from.
And that gets back to the agency that we talked about as well, which is so important. It's a fascinating book. And again, there's no time to go through all or even part of it, which is why I again urge you. The book is out right now. It's not quite out now, but we're taping this beforehand. So it is out right now as you're listening to this. And you can get it on Amazon. We will have links to, you can get it wherever good books are sold. We'll have links up on the post that accompanies this, on the Reddit post that we will be accompanying this with. And definitely go out and check it out. It is called We Are the Land, and we have the two authors right here, Willy Bauer and Damon Akins. Thank you so much for the both of you for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the chance.
Yeah, great.
Willy Bauer is a professor of history at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and also a member of the Round Valley Indian Tribe, and Damon Akins, associate professor of history at Guilford College. I'm Tyler Alderson. You have been listening to the Ask Historians podcast, and we will see you for the next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.